Thank you. Thanks for having me at CogX again this year. It's a real pleasure to moderate a discussion on perhaps one of the weightiest topics that we'll come across in this year's CogX. Lethal autonomous weapons have been described as the third revolution in warfare after gunpowder and nuclear weapons. And for many of us, they conjure up pretty extreme images of swarms of CyLons in Battlestar Galactica, or even the Terminator's Skynet, something that's kind of far off in the future. But actually, more pedestrian autonomy is already a reality and is becoming integrated into military systems in varying degrees already. How far this trend will take us towards truly autonomous systems is one of the most pressing issues facing us today. Is it even possible to build an arms control system for these sorts of weapons, or do we need to act now to prevent any further development? Today, we have the opportunity to discuss these questions with two leading experts. The first, as Charlie said, spoke fantastically well on this subject last year. Stuart Russell is Professor of Computer Science at the University of California, Berkeley. He is the co-author of the standard undergraduate textbook on AI and serves on numerous high-level advisory groups on AI, including the World Economic Forum's Council on AI and Robotics. His most recent book, Human Compatible, addresses the problem of human control in the age of AI. And he's joined by Sir Richard Barrons, who advises the public and private sector on transformation in defence. Richard served for nearly 40 years in the British Army, retiring as the 4-star head of Joint Forces Command, now known as Strategic Command, in which role he oversaw joint operations, special forces, and cybersecurity, among other responsibilities. Stuart, I'm going to ask you first, if you don't mind, to set the scene for us, starting with perhaps the deceptively simple question of what is AI and what has it got to do with weapons?
Thank you, Grace. It's great to be back. I'm really sorry that we can't be doing this in London in person. Yeah. So let's begin with AI. AI means making machines intelligent. And that includes allowing them to function successfully in the real world. And the connection with weapons is that if you could add AI to a weapon, then it can function successfully by itself rather than being wielded by a human being. The weapon itself becomes equivalent to the combination of a human being and a weapon. And that has a number of advantages, and I'm sure Richard will talk about the military thinking on this topic. So this gives us what we call a lethal autonomous weapon. And in the United Nations definition, it's a weapon that locates, selects, and engages. So engages is a euphemism for kills human targets without human supervision. And that last part is extremely important. So we're not talking about remotely piloted drones, the Predators and Global Hawks that fly around killing people right now. Those are all commanded by humans. There's a human looking through the camera, a human deciding where to go and when to shoot. We're also not talking about things like anti-missile defense systems, which are capable of being put into a fully autonomous mode, but they're shooting down missiles, and the missiles are not carrying human passengers, so they're not lethal weapons. It's also important to say we're not talking about Terminator robots. If you see an article in any newspaper anywhere in the world on autonomous weapons, invariably, despite my protestations, there will be a picture of a Terminator robot. And the reason why we don't want Terminator robots in these pictures is because that makes everyone think that this is science fiction, that we don't have to worry about this for 20 or 30 years. And in fact, every time the Russian ambassador gets on the stage in Geneva at the UN, he'll say, there's no point talking about this because these things won't exist for 20 or 30 years. And this is nonsense. We're not talking about science fiction. The technology already exists, and you can go and buy them right now. So if you have a phone handy, and if Grace doesn't mind, then take it out and do a search for STM, that's the name of the manufacturer, Kargu, K-A-R-G-U. And that's a small drone that's fully autonomous. It's advertised as having human kill capability, autonomous face recognition, etc., etc. There are also lots of prototype weapons being tested by militaries as we speak: submarines, small boats, destroyers, tanks, fighter aircraft, long-range bombers, etc. So that set of situations has created a great deal of concern within the AI community.
Thank you, Stuart. So this is a really important question of our time, and it's not going to go away. This isn't technology that you can somehow imagine away or disinvent. And the first thing we should accept is we shouldn't be surprised by this evolution. There are, I think, two eternal truths about war. The first is the nature of war never changes. It's always a brutal and feral and generally disappointing aspect of human life. But the character of it, its form, that changes all the time with thinking and technology. So Napoleon, for example, advanced tactics, and as Grace has described, nuclear weapons have changed weapons. And so, of course, how the digital age, all those technologies, AI, autonomy, robotics, processing power, biosciences, how all of those things in combination are changing how we all live and work and play, they are going to change how we fight. And some of this might be a bit techie in the military lane. It'll be about changing how intelligence and surveillance and reconnaissance is done, and it'll be about changing how command and control is done, I think in the most profound way for 150 years. But in the arena of combat power, in the way that navies and armies and air forces are constructed, they're going to shift from being a mix of people with equipment to a mix of people with equipment, but also unmanned systems, not the subject today, and autonomous systems, which have the potential to be lethal. And the attractiveness of the military of going to a manned, unmanned, autonomous mix is that it'll make them cheaper, because frankly they'll need fewer people, and regular soldiers, sailors, and Marines are really expensive. And it'll make them more effective. They can conceive of building navies, armies, and air forces that are bigger and more resilient, and take people out of harm's way. It's a really complex debate, because in many cases we're talking about technology developed in the civil sector by people who don't really have a military thought, or even are allergic to it. And the things that they develop for commercial or public-spirited purposes are then going to be looked at and potentially applied by military organizations around the world. In a world where generally law and regulation lags behind technology 3 to 5 years at least. And some of the militaries that look at this problem around the world will have very different laws and value systems to, say, a Western European armed forces. And we're all going to be looking at this in a world which will feel much harder, where risks feel greater. And when risks feel greater, the enthusiasm for regulation and restraint generally dissipates a little bit. So lethal autonomous weapon systems already exist, as described. They can be defensive, and they can be traditional, like mines, which in at least in the anti-personnel world in many countries have already banned them. But the fact is, these weapon systems are going to potentially be constructed now, where a machine will kill a person without a human supervising or intervening. And some will argue that makes armies, navies, air forces more effective and takes people out of harm's way. But we need to think very carefully about this.
I wonder, Stuart, if you could tell us about efforts that are underway already to address some of the practical and ethical challenges that this raises. I know that there have been discussions going on in Geneva since, I think, 2014 on this subject. Perhaps you could outline some of that for us.
Sure. So in Geneva, the United Nations maintains what's called the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. Actually, it's an even longer title than that, but usually people call it CCW for short. And that's where the member states of the UN discuss what they are willing to countenance on the battlefield and what they're not willing to countenance. So over history in that venue and various other venues, nations have agreed bans on chemical weapons, on biological weapons, more recently on blinding laser weapons, on landmines. But even going back to the 19th century, there were bans on small caliber explosive ordnance. That means that you couldn't shoot bullet-sized objects that exploded inside people. And that ban is largely still in place, amazingly, from, I think, 1858. So the discussion in Geneva is about whether or not we should ban lethal autonomous weapons. And so far, about 30 nations have announced support for a ban in one form or another. And that includes China, but it doesn't include the United Kingdom, the United States, and Russia. So given that the CCW requires consensus to move forward, things are pretty much stuck diplomatically as far as Geneva is concerned. And some of the reasons that things are not moving forward, obviously, as Sir Richard pointed out, there's a significant military interest in these weapons for increasing military capabilities. And obviously, if one country could increase military capabilities, then other countries feel they need to match that. Otherwise, they'll fall behind. Another question is verification. So if you did have a ban, then how would you be sure that countries were complying with that ban? But the issues discussed in the CCW usually have to do with what's called international humanitarian law, or IHL. So this is what we normally think of as the Geneva Conventions and the sort of bad things you're not supposed to do on the battlefield. So one of those principles is that you have to be able to discriminate, or your weapon system has to be able to be used in a discriminating fashion to attack military and not civilian targets. Another rule is the rule of necessity, that you can't attack even a military target if there's no military necessity for doing so. So actually, this might surprise some people that in some ways the battlefield is supposedly a more honorable place than you might think. There's also a rule about proportionality. You're not supposed to engage in an attack of a scale that will cause more collateral damage than the military value of the target. So disproportionate collateral damage is also not allowed. And obviously, there are questions about whether autonomous weapons could comply with these. I would say for discrimination between civilian and military targets, that's a difficult question. Clearly, human soldiers get that wrong sometimes, and autonomous weapons will get it wrong. But it's sort of a moving target, so to speak. Technology will improve, and perhaps in some circumstances might already be comparable to human soldiers. But necessity and proportionality, I think, are really out of the question right now. So that would really limit the scope of missions that autonomous weapons could undertake under present law. But beyond IHL, beyond the legal situation, there's also just the straightforward security consideration that when you have autonomous weapons, because they don't have to be supervised to carry out their attacks, you can launch essentially unlimited numbers of attacks from a single command and control center. You can, for example, put about 1 million lethal autonomous weapons into a single truck, a single container. And so that container now has the killing capability of a nuclear weapon, but it's much cheaper. It's much more effective. It can be selective in who it kills. It doesn't leave behind radiation and material destruction. And it's very easy to proliferate. So now you have weapons of mass destruction that are cheap, scalable, and proliferate easily. And that makes the international security situation much worse. So this is the main reason why the AI community almost unanimously is opposed to moving forward with autonomous weapons.
Thank you. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's taken aback to know that the UK and US are in company with Russia on this debate, and on the other side to China. Richard, do you have any insight into how the UK's position on this issue has evolved in recent years, and whether we may find ourselves shifting so that we can undo this deadlock in Geneva?
So I think this debate has a really long way to go. I think, as Stuart has described, we're not really talking about science fiction. This is science fact. But in many ways, still in the foothills of where technology will take the ability to construct lethal autonomous weapons. I would like to think that it'll be easy as time passes to get a consensus to ban lethal autonomous weapons of mass destruction. And I think there is a clear mutual self-interest between nations that no one should have these, and an absolute fear that this capability would fall in the hands of non-state actors, whether motivated by outrage or prejudice or faith or just fear. That the bar to entry to this technology will get lower and lower. I think part of the problem is at the other end of the scale, where you can conceive of building a lethal autonomous weapon in what will feel like a grey area. So it's a small example, but in the context where you are breaking into, say, a compound, and you want to believe that compound is full of terrorists with whom you've taken exception. And right now, when you breach that compound, the first through the hole of the wall is a dog or a soldier, and that's a high-risk occupation. And many people say to me, "Well, that's just their job." And if you send a machine, a lethal autonomous weapon system that goes through that breach and within the limits of its technology is necessary, discriminatory, and proportionate, discuss, will very effectively kill what it finds. And they say this is outrageous. And then I say, well, okay, so if we don't conceive of building these machines, we're going to send a person. And if that person is your son or daughter, how do you feel about that? And at that point, they generally become real enthusiasts for a lethal autonomous weapon system in that setting. So I think we're going to have a much more sophisticated discussion. And as Stuart, I think, mentioned, one of the problems with treaties and bans is many people who don't sign up because they don't believe the people who have signed up will actually stick to what they've said.
Of course, and some of the other treaties to ban other kinds of weapons, one could argue, have had somewhat easier verification regimes because the precursors and so on are typically more difficult to find, more difficult to distribute, more difficult to put together. Whereas from what Stuart's saying earlier, many of the precursors, if you like, for lethal autonomous weapon systems are actually readily available, often from civil producers, and can probably be put together without too much difficulty. I think there's also a cybersecurity angle here to consider with these weapons, that given how, with what relative ease they may be able to be put together, is it also the case that they run a particular risk of being hacked by those who would just like to take control of them for their own ends? Stuart, is that something that in your work on this subject has been given any particular consideration?
Absolutely, yeah. So from the point of view of regular militaries, the question would be, okay, now we've committed, and a large part of our defense posture depends on having autonomous weapons, navies, air forces, and so on. How sure are we that those weapons are actually fighting for us and not for the other side when we actually switch them on and commit them to combat? So that creates a great deal of uncertainty, particularly uncertainty about the balance of strategic power and capability. And the balance of strategic capabilities is really essential for maintaining the status quo. If one side is worried that the other side may gain some advantage, which would render its own forces inadequate, then it might be tempted to act preemptively. So I'm not really an expert on all the sort of game theory of conflict, but it seems to me that introducing this extra and very significant element of uncertainty in the analysis of strategic balance is possibly not a good idea. And you mentioned the question of being confident about nations complying with a ban. I think this is a very important issue. That I would agree that there's no point in having a ban that can't be verified. And actually, I spent quite a bit of the last 10 years developing verification systems for the nuclear test ban treaty. And for this type of weapon, I think there are useful analogies to the chemical weapons treaty. So the precursors of chemical weapons are widely available industrial chemicals. You can buy them by the ton. And in order to prevent that kind of proliferation, particularly to non-state actors, the manufacturers of those chemicals are all required to register. Every nation that signs up to the treaty has to have a national authority that's in charge of keeping track of who these chemicals are sold to and are they bona fide customers and so on. So I think you would want something similar for example, manufacturers of quadcopters, which could be easily converted, as you point out, into weapons. And I think that it's actually, I'm sorry to say, it's actually inevitable that we will see some amount of, as it were, garage conversion happening. We know that non-state actors are already using remotely piloted small drones with explosives to kill soldiers on the battlefield. So it's inevitable, I think, that because those remotely piloted vehicles can be jammed, they will start using autonomous vehicles, and we'll start to see terrorist attacks using autonomous weapons that are homemade. But I don't believe that they can make millions of weapons without detection. And I think that's the crucial part, is to prevent large-scale manufacturing of these weapons. And that's been successful with chemical weapons. There are still chemical attacks by some of the non-signatories, Syria being one of them. But by and large, the previous weapon bans have been quite successful, particularly when they have verification. So the first chemical weapons treaty at the turn of the 20th century, before the First World War, didn't have any verification, and it actually allowed production and deployment, but not use. So you were allowed to make chemical weapons and have them with your militaries, but you weren't ever allowed to use them, and that, of course, didn't last very long once the shooting started. So a ban that banned development, deployment, use, and included verification, I think, could be quite effective.
Thank you. Thanks, Stuart. Believe it or not, we're already at the end of our allotted time for the first part of the discussion. Happily, we're going to have a further period for Q&A. But I think, unless, Richard, you have anything you'd like to come back on specifically to Stuart's last observations, I'll give you this opportunity now.
I just want to reinforce that I think the challenge of cyber resilience in a world where you have pervasive surveillance, the development of the Internet of Things, and a cyber risk which isn't so much about technology, it's about people and the insider threat, but the impossibility of being sure that your autonomous weapons work for you all the time is a very good reason for not having them, particularly at scale.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as someone who works in cyber myself, I would strongly agree with that. So, okay, well, thank you both very much for your contributions so far. We're going to take a very short break, I believe, at this point, and Charlie will tell us how we move to the next section of the conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you, Grace. So that was obviously one of the most important topics, and we only just got into it. So thank you for those who've been watching. Thank you to the panel. We're now going to move to the breakout Q&A. Now, to find that, if you're in the application at Virtual CogX, you just need to go to the What's Happening section and pick out the breakout Q&A for lethal autonomous weapons, or you can go to the filter around tracks and click breakout, and you'll see it there as well. So please do go and continue the conversation there. Any questions that were asked during this first session will be brought across to the second session, and you'll be able to ask more questions there. So thank you to the panel, and we look forward to seeing you in the breakout.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.